I can now start with the official welcome to another Agora online event. I'm sure there will still be people entering the room, which is why we are going to repeat a few things every now and then, because otherwise they may miss them. And I will also leave on the Menti poll to find out from where you're all tuned in, because it's colorful and nice, and it shows that we have actually participants from all over the world. So, hello everybody. My name is Nicola Bock. I am head of events at Agora Energiewende, and I am going to be a host today, leading you through this online event. What sort of topic do we have on the agenda for today? Well, I can tell it must be a hot one, because we received more than 1,000 registrations for this event, which for us is a record. So I believe there has to be something with that hydrogen topic. We haven't actually worked on the topic so far yet, but we have started to build a little team and decided to conduct a project on no regret hydrogen infrastructure for Europe. And we didn't write the report on our own, Agora Energiewende, but with the support of AFRY, which is an international engineering, design, and advisory company. And the people involved in the report will be introduced to you later. What is on the agenda today? We will start with presentations of the colleagues who were involved in writing the report from Agora Energiewende and AFRY. We also invited a representative from the European Commission to comment on the findings of the report. And we will then have a Q&A session where you, the audience, have the opportunity to raise questions, and they will be discussed in a panel discussion. Before we head into the content part, let me make you familiar with the Zoom environment, because unfortunately, we cannot see you. I mean, I can see a big list of names. I think we have more than 550 people attending at the moment, and there are still people entering the room, but we don't see your faces. There's no way you switch on your microphone or you put on your video. But of course, you can get in contact with us. And there are two options. At the bottom of your screen, you see a chat window and a Q&A window. And we have two different ways of using those. The chat window is for any technical or organizational issues. So anything like, where can I find the presentation? Where can I find the study? When will the recording be online, or things like that? You can put in there, and we will take care of those. All the questions you put in there will remain invisible for the audience, and my colleague Craig and me, we will take care of those. And usually we manage to answer all of them and find a solution if there are any problems. The other window, the Q&A window, is probably for some of you the more relevant one, because it's the content related, or the window for the content related questions. So any questions regarding the report, the presentation, please put those into the Q&A window, because only if it's there, we can take it into consideration for the Q&A session. And maybe I can ask my colleagues, Craig Morris and Njivomir Flis, to quickly show their faces so that participants actually see who is going to take care of the Q&As that end up in the Q&A session. So Craig and Njivomir will have a look at them, go through them, cluster them, and pick the ones that we can use for the panel discussion. Looking at the number of persons, I can already guarantee you that we won't be able to answer all of your questions, because I'm personally expecting more than 100, and there's no way of answering them in half an hour Q&A session. But of course, we will do our best to address as many as possible. And we may also answer a few of them, the more quick and easy to answer ones, in writing. So have a look at your Q&A window. Whenever there's something red popping up, then there's a new answer to a question. right? We also are recording the webinar because we would like to make it public on the website afterwards for anyone who couldn't make it to today's event. And I, on the left, have a control monitor where I see exactly what you see to make sure that everything runs smoothly. So don't be surprised that I keep on checking that monitor. And I believe that's it on housekeeping. And I would like to hand over now to Frank Peter, who is Deputy Executive Director at Agora Energiewende and the moderator of the presentation and Q&A session today. The floor is yours, Frank.
Thank you very much, Nicola. Good morning. Very warm welcome also from my side. My name is Frank Peter. I'm heading Agora's work on industry. Our recent work we are publishing contains studies on a clean industry package of Europe, breakthrough strategies for a climate neutral industry in Europe, which you can download from our website. The industry department is the last one we just added a year ago to our portfolio of work that we obtain here within Agora. My current impression is if you really want to have webinars with a record attendance, put hydrogen in the headline and there you go. So hopes are high that it can help Europe considerably in becoming climate neutral by 2050. But there are also big uncertainties. Where will hydrogen play a key role? Herbert Diess, the CEO of Volkswagen, just came up with a recent statement on Twitter saying green hydrogen is needed for steel, chemical, aero, and should not end up in cars. Far too expensive, inefficient, slow, and difficult to roll out in transport. So this gives you a short impression what the discourse currently is all about. Where should hydrogen go? But even for the sectors where hydrogen as of now is seen as a no regret, there is the well-known chicken and egg problem of hydrogen infrastructure. Given uncertain demand, it is hard to invest into delivery systems as of now. So how can we provide more certainty here was one question that we want to answer with the study that we want to publish today. We want to identify early options for anchoring hydrogen infrastructure around inescapable demand. This is what we would try to figure out with the study. And by that, we mean industries such as steel, ammonia, or other high-value chemicals that cannot become net zero with renewable electricity alone are the sectors we should look at when starting to ramp up the hydrogen work. From our daily work with industrial stakeholders, we know that industry is ready to kickstart the transformation towards climate neutrality, but there needs to be more clarity on the necessary infrastructure, and therefore we have commissioned AFRY Management Consulting to analyze such infrastructure needs and implications. We are glad that Angus Paxton, from principal at AFRY, will present the study and the key findings. Thereafter, my colleague Matthias Deutsch will present the conclusions we have drawn from AFRY's analysis, and Joachim Balke from the European Commission, head of the unit in charge of the green infrastructure transformation, will then give us his remarks on our findings. So let's not waste the time because we have a lot of things to discuss. Angus, please, the floor is yours. Present us your results.
Thank you very much, Frank. Welcome, everybody. Good morning. I can't see the slides, Nicola. Could you put them up? Thank you very much. Thank you very much for attending this webinar and coming to listen to me talk about the project that we've done for Agora and for participating in this webinar. Can I have the next slide, please, Matthias? So we were invited to do this study with Agora, and it was very exciting to be invited to do it. You know, I see that hydrogen is a potential vector that can support massive decarbonisation, and therefore it's really good Before I go into that, just tell you a little bit about AFRY Management Consulting and a little bit about myself. AFRY Management Consulting is part of the AFRY business, which is approximately 17,500 engineers and designers all around the world. We're headquartered in Stockholm in Sweden, and we've got a long history stemming from forest industry and from steam boiler pipe certification back in the 19th century. AFRY Management Consulting is about 500 management consultants working across forest industry and energy sectors. There's about 250 of those consultants working solely in the energy sector. We provide advice to a variety of different types of clients, industrial clients, energy companies, network businesses, regulators, governments, banks and financial institutions, and now Agora Energiewende, pleased to say. We've got quite a strong presence in hydrogen topics, advising on corporate and investment strategies, economics and regulation. And sometimes some of this work also involves some of our engineers, and we've got a number of hydrogen engineers in the organisation too. Also, our electricity model, BID 3, is also quite well known in European electricity circles. It's used by a lot of the European electricity TSOs for capacity and network planning. And BID 3 is now also incorporating hydrogen and production and consumption economics into it. My name is Angus Paxton. I'm a principal at AFRY Management Consulting. I provide advice and support on a lot of subjects stemming from my background in gas transportation. I've been at AFRY for 15 years and doing consultancy across the space. Prior to that, I've spent nearly 10 years at National Grid Gas, planning the national gas transmission network. So I've got quite a lot of experience of planning gas networks. Now, hydrogen is a potential vector that support massive decarbonisation. It's really good. Matthias, if you could give me a click. It's really good because, of course, I started in the gas industry, and hydrogen's going to rescue the oil and gas industry, right? And I'd say that looking at the 2050s and the decarbonisation that we have to achieve by then, from here in the 2020s, is a bit like looking at the 2020s from the 1990s, which is what I started my career doing. So I've kind of come full circle, but now I'm looking at a different gas. Next slide, I'll talk about the project. Thanks, Matthias. Now, the project kind of naturally fell into three separate components to look at, looking at demand, production or supply, and then looking at the delivery systems that might be required. The premise of the project was to look at the no regrets situation, the things that we could do as a society that we would not regret, regardless of the path to decarbonisation. So this no regret demand is really to be found in those hard to decarbonise industrial sectors. We've looked at steel production, ammonia, methanol production, and the petrochemicals and chemicals industry, and in particular, the chemicals plastic recycling opportunity. The way we went about producing these demand forecasts was to project demand for those particular sectors, for the commodities that are being produced, and then apply some conversion factors to convert those forecasts into forecasts of hydrogen demand. And we did this on a locational basis because we wanted to, well, because obviously the spatial element here is going to be very important for planning infrastructure and pipelines. That was the demand side of things. We then moved on to look at the supply side of things, and here there were a couple of key assumptions that I'll talk about. We created two separate supply scenarios. One was a blue-green scenario, and the other was a fast green scenario. In both scenarios, where we are looking at supply of hydrogen, production of hydrogen from electrolysis, we looked at the narrow scope of just looking at dedicated res production. So where there is an electrolyzer, it is attached to solar or PV or some hybrid of solar and PV res production. SMR was also allowed in the blue-green scenario, but only where CCS would be available. So namely the UK, Netherlands and Norway. Across both scenarios, we had quite a large reduction in electrolyzer costs. And this reduction in costs was greater in the fast green scenario. And this was consistent with some other studies that are out there. There are also a set of assumptions in there about the levelization parameters, so discount rates, asset lives, etc. We did all this analysis to look at the costs of hydrogen production across Europe, and it results in, unsurprisingly, it results in a range of different costs for hydrogen production. Now, the demand being a volume thing and the supply being a cost thing was arranged into it was assigned to a grid of hexagons. So we split the geography up, covered it in hexagons. We assigned demand to each hexagon where appropriate, and we had a cost for hydrogen production in each hexagon. But then to look at the delivery systems that might be required, we generated a set of unit costs for pipeline, for maritime transport of hydrogen in liquid form, for the interface between land and sea, so liquefaction and regasification. And we had cost assumptions in there about the costs of storing hydrogen. And the question we're really trying to ask is, for any demand for hexagon, any hexagon with a demand in it, what is the cheapest source of hydrogen to supply that hexagon? Given that the costs of transportation also need to be integrated into that thought. We created a new algorithm, we created a new model to do that. We've called that model Hexamodel. And Hexamodel works there's two passes to it. The first pass, what it does is it looks at transporting produced hydrogen to a point of storage. And then the second pass of it looks at moving the stored hydrogen then to a point of demand. I should say that, just going back to the demand very briefly, because we are looking at the industrial sector, I think we made the assumption, and it was safe to make the assumption, that demand was flat. It was going to be, relatively constant over the year. So 365 days a year, 24 hours a day, it's a flat demand. But it's being supplied by sources of hydrogen which are for the res dedicated electrolyzer hydrogen, that it's volatile. It's following the pattern of wind. It's following the pattern of solar production that's available to it. So storage is definitely needed, and that's why storage was integrated into the Hexamodel here. And that's kind of what we've done through the project. Matthias, if you'd like to go on to the next slide. The results came out. Now, we produced a large number of results, and this shows us that actually we've discovered lots of routes where demand for hydrogen is better served by hydrogen that's produced elsewhere in Europe, and that therefore there is clear value in establishing hydrogen delivery systems. We produced a large number of results as a result there for each demand node, each demand hexagon. Now, whilst in any one scenario we produced a lot of routes, it wasn't any particular route wasn't necessarily repeated in the other scenario and year combinations. And what was really important for Agora was to identify the infrastructure that could be considered as no regret infrastructure. And so we went through a process of extracting the common results, the common themes that came out of that large set of results. I should say, by the way, that the large set of results is available through Tableau. There should be a link there's a link in the report, and there should be a link posted in the chat to allow you to dig into detail into all of those results. So extracting the common themes, we applied some selection criteria, and those that selection criteria then ended up in us identifying the no regret infrastructure there that's shown on the right. And that shows that there are these 4 clusters where establishing hydrogen infrastructure is going to be valuable for the economy, and we can do it to serve that industrial demand that is a no regret demand. That's almost like the minimum hydrogen demand that we can expect. And so we're demonstrating that actually there is an economic need for this no regret infrastructure. I'd like to go on to the next slide. I'd like to talk, though, I think Matthias will talk a little bit more about that no regret infrastructure side of things, but I just want to talk about some of the wider results that we've taken from this modeling. In any given scenario, the infrastructure opportunity is greater than that no regret infrastructure. As I showed on the previous slide, there were a lot of results, and there's a lot of opportunities there for establishing hydrogen infrastructure to lower the cost of serving a hydrogen demand. Another key part of our results and the discovery here is that the model wants to make use of those gas pipelines that can be repurposed for the use of hydrogen. They are cheaper, and so even if it means deviating a little bit from a straight line, the model will do that to make use of those repurposed pipelines. So maybe the concept of hydrogen could rescue parts of the gas industry, going back to my opening point. But as I say, it's different across different scenarios. Another key result from this is that the costs of storage are really quite a considerable impact on the routing of pipelines. And we saw many cases in the results where the model would deliberately deviate a pipeline route to be able to reach salt strata so that it could make use of salt cavern storage. Salt cavern storage appears to be considerably cheaper, orders of magnitude cheaper than above ground steel contained hydrogen storage. And so that's a key result as well, because across Europe, we've only got salt strata in specific locations, and we are going to potentially need to access those locations for storing hydrogen. Okay, next slide. Thank you. Oh, go back up one, that's it. Now, our model has assumed a co-located, dedicated renewable energy is providing a lot of the hydrogen that we've assumed in our modeling. These electrolyzers are not attached to the grid; they're just attached to that dedicated res. But we know that if you locate electrolyzers correctly on the grid and you connect them to the electricity grid, you can drive additional value, and that should lower the cost of hydrogen yet further. But in order to understand these locational issues, you need to model both the power and the hydrogen networks to be able to value hydrogen properly. Now, we have, in this study, we have just looked at the hydrogen infrastructure, but I think it's really important for us to consider the electricity infrastructure as well, because there are questions there about where you should place the generation, where you should place the electrolyzers, and the electricity grid is going to be a key component in that, but the hydrogen grid is also going to be a key component in that. I was asked a question recently about, what's the story here? Where are these electrolyzers going to be located? And I think we need to think about the potential future, the potential rollout of electrolyzer capacity into the future. And there's a kind of brief story there. I think initially we'll see deployments of demonstration plants, which are, low tens of megawatt maybe, and these will be at specific consumers. And that activity is happening now. It's happening today. We might start to see those consumers' neighbours on an industrial site also wanting to deploy electrolyzers. And that might therefore lead to some sharing of electrolyzer capacity, some sharing of above ground on-site storage, and the development of local hydrogen distribution pipelines. But the electrolyzers that are located there may start to be impacted by electricity network constraints. And we might see that sometimes might provide additional value to the owners of the electrolyzers. Sometimes it may actually lead to a higher cost of hydrogen where the network constraints frustrate access to lower price production hours. So those sorts of things might happen. We're going to eventually see larger clusters established, tens, maybe hundreds of gigawatts, and these may possibly be interlinked with the use of a backbone, or with a use of an infrastructure that's there specifically for, I don't know, security supply purposes or something like that. But I think the key question is, at what point does a remotely produced hydrogen that can be transported to a demand cluster, at what point can that be delivered at a cost that undercuts the variable cost of the local production? I think at that point, once we reach that point, and I think the economics indicate that we could get there, we'll start to see the deployment of a wider hydrogen backbone. And once that starts to be established, there's then questions about, what other uses can we find for hydrogen? How else can we use it for decarbonizing? And we may want to decarbonize towns or something like that. That's kind of the story there. And I think the next slide is just a final parting comment that, the decarbonization challenge is hard. Getting it done is possible. We know it's possible. But getting it done right is it's that much harder. And this comes back to the kind of heart of the question of, how much hydrogen demand will there be in the future? Now, we know we can do an awful lot of things with electrolyzing things, but the question is, how much more might we be able to do? How more efficient might we be able to deliver that? And I think in order to answer those questions, you have to get into some really very detailed modeling. It isn't just about looking at hydrogen in isolation, and I think that the important takeaway I say from this is that whilst Hexamodel is doing some excellent work in identifying the hydrogen infrastructure shouldn't be considered in isolation, and we need to consider the whole system. I think I now hand, that's the end of my presentation. I really hope you've enjoyed listening to it, and I hope to speak to you again in some Q&A in a few moments, but now I hand back to Frank. Thank you, Frank.
Thank you, Angus. Before going to Matthias, we have another quick poll in the making. Nicola, please guide us through this.
Yes, thank you. I will start the poll and it should now appear on your screen. If it doesn't, don't worry, then apparently you're not using the full version of Zoom, but maybe only the browser version. Then unfortunately you cannot participate, but I will read out the questions so at least you know what the others are voting for. The question is, which sector should be prioritized for hydrogen? And possible answers are A, ground-based transportation, B, aviation, maritime transport, C, industry, D, building heat, E, backup power generation, F, all sectors, or G, I haven't made up my mind yet. And I will give you a few more seconds to make up your mind and choose one of the options. It's single choice. And I can see you voting, and I will publish the results in a second. Yeah, some 400 of you have already answered. So I think the last ones, make up your mind. And I will stop now and make it visible for all of you. And the winner is a majority of 59%, which equals 307 persons from the audience. And we are currently some 630 persons attending, say that industry should be prioritized for hydrogen, followed by, there's a long time nothing, then 12% say all sectors should be equally prioritized. And then we have aviation, maritime transport with 9%, backup power generation 8%, ground-based transportation 6%. I haven't made up my mind yet, say 4%, which is still 23 persons. And then building heat, 10 persons, 2%. And with that, I hand over to Matthias with the presentation, if I'm right, or with follow-up of the presentation.
Yes, thank you, Nicola. Matthias is next in line. So 60% almost in favor of industry prioritization is something I wouldn't have expected it that way. But maybe, yeah, we haven't been that bad with our assumption given to Angus to look at the no regrets coming from industry to ramp up a hydrogen infrastructure. Matthias, having this in mind and with the results also that we have been shown by Angus, what's our conclusion of this? Please guide us through this.
Yes, thank you, Frank. I think, and I hope you can hear me. What we have in mind here is some rough conclusions on the demand side, supply, and the delivery system side of things. And so you just saw the diversity in responses, but there's a tendency to say industry is important, and that's what we focused on. And so the first conclusion really is industry, hard to abate industry sectors, represent a major area of hydrogen demand. So no surprise to many of our audience, the audience here today, because there's a lack of alternative decarbonization options. And let's have a look at this diagram, because this really represents those demands that have to do with feedstock or reaction agents, and they really need molecules. And so 3 observations on this graph here. First observation, it's roughly constant, roughly, let's say 300 terawatt hours. And this is terawatt hours from 2020 to 2050. Second observation, refineries in pink are phased out until, let's say, 2040, 2050. That's an assumption, because we built this on an idea of moving towards a climate neutral Europe, and there will be less of a space for refineries then. At the same time, ammonia is relatively stable, and what comes in as the new demand is steel. Now, as Angus already referred to, what does that mean in terms of geography? Because it's not all at the same place. Now, steel, ammonia refineries, chemical plants are widely distributed across Europe. And again, this is terawatt hours per year. This is a projection for 2050. And just by looking at the graph, you see there are different shades of blue. And this means there are really different orders of magnitude of demand. Some are below 1 terawatt hour, which you can see a 0 there. Others are in the range of 10 to 30 terawatt hours in the respective hexagons. That's a huge difference. And you can see high demand, for example, in Belgium, Netherlands, Germany. There are large clusters of chemical installations, steel plants, but also you see clusters in Eastern Europe and then along the Mediterranean. Bearing in mind, again, this is already the 2050 outlook. So the phase out of refineries is already kind of reflected, and the phase in of steel is already reflected in here. Is this a good storyline? Is this a plausible projection, let's say, especially for the new dominating steel as a hard to abate, no regret demand? We think it is. And let me show you some reasons why we think this is something that we should talk about and keep in mind. We know from steel producers all over Europe, they plan to move to direct reduced iron steel, where you need hydrogen. And Europeans are not the only ones thinking about this. There are announcements from China, from Korea recently. So in our understanding, this is good evidence that the race to climate neutrality is on. And this involves green steel. And it's about global competition and technology leadership. And therefore, we see this as one of the very uncontroversial industrial demands for hydrogen, what we consider no regret. Now, what's not in here in this picture of hard-to-abate industrial demand is something that is also associated with industry. It is heat, industrial heat demand. Because we think that's way more controversial, and we need to talk about that. Because there are some things that some actors may actually think directly that hydrogen is the only way for high temperature industrial heat to continue production in a net zero or an environmental world. But let me share a nice pie chart with you on the next slide, which shows you what's the temperature level at which industry uses natural gas today. Now, in pink, you can see that for 2017, about 40% of industrial natural gas use in the EU went to heat below 100 degrees Celsius. And then there's another temperature bracket, 100 to 500 degrees Celsius, and then the dark blue is above 500 degrees Celsius. Now, what this tells us is that below 100 degrees Celsius, that's something we remember from building heat. And this temperature level can be supplied with heat pumps. If you put in 1 kilowatt hour of electricity as input, you get out 2 to 5 kilowatt hours of heat output. And that's the thing you want to have when you think about kind of using energy in an efficient way. So it looks like a good idea to really think hard which segments, which parts of those below 100 degrees Celsius kilowatt hours, terawatt hours can be supplied with direct electricity and heat pumps. And then compared to that, the blue segment to the right-hand side, hydrogen looks not as good. So it doesn't make much sense from our perspective to approach the question of industrial heat demand in a very general way, but really thinking about different temperature ranges makes a lot of sense. But even if you think about higher temperatures, there is a way to look at power to heat using renewable electricity directly. And for power to heat, there's been a prominent paper, academic paper published recently, and we basically draw very much on this paper to show what is out there. Now, this chart about higher temperature, if you look upper part on the x-axis, it's about, again, performance factors between 0 and 1. And then you see a lot of pink technologies that are power to heat, using electricity to produce heat, its resistance, infrared, induction, electric arc, plasma, microwave, you name it. So a lot of technology options out there with the efficiencies or their performance factors. And then below you find hydrogen, different forms. The general picture seems to be that, whoa, okay, so the power to heat stuff doesn't look bad. In fact, it looks a bit better than the hydrogen road. And if we know, in addition, that essentially those available power to heat technologies can deliver and can cover all temperature ranges needed in industrial production. To give you one example, electric arc furnace in steel production is around 3,500 degrees Celsius. So we can deliver heat through electricity. And we're not saying that this diagram shows all the practical and implementation problems, challenges, by no means. But we want to say that let's just critically reassess the claim that high temperature heat in an industry really needs hydrogen. Before we jump into that conclusion, we would like to critically reassess what's out there for which temperature range and what can be kind of practically be applied when we look at other constraints that are not represented in this chart. So we want to have a creative discussion on this. That's one of our conclusions. Let me jump to supply. That was about demand so far. For the supply side, this is all about renewable hydrogen, but not only. But here's a famous picture from DII and Fraunhofer ISI that we were allowed to reproduce here. There is solar and wind resources in Europe all over the place. You can mix them. That gives you a hybrid plant, solar and wind hybrids. And this is important because we need to tap those resources for direct electricity and for renewable hydrogen production. It's not only one. We need it for both. And so it's not cannot all be reserved for hydrogen production. And renewable hydrogen is at the core of AFRY's analysis. In addition, as Angus said, there are two scenarios. In one scenario, the blue-green also adds the option of SMR-CCS, so that's fossil-based hydrogen with carbon capture in some countries, where it's under discussion actually. And then the fast green scenario, there's no SMR-CCS. There's a more aggressive reduction in electrolyzer cost. And that's, we think, in line with the strategy of the European Union and its hydrogen strategy. So in this modeling, technologies compete against each other in terms of their levelized cost of hydrogen. Now, one of the questions for us really was, what's then the outlook for fossil-based hydrogen with carbon capture? And our conclusion from looking at the results that AFRY produced is that the investment window for fossil-based hydrogen with carbon capture remains open, but in the long run, renewable hydrogen will emerge as the most competitive option in Europe. And you see the two scenarios. To the left is blue-green and to the right is fast-green. Now in the blue-green to the left, you see the color codes at the bottom for the technology with the best levelized cost of hydrogen. In the middle of Europe, in the center, you see a lot of hybrids, solar and wind, and then solar in the south, wind in the north, but also SMR-CCS in the north for 2030. And our conclusion is that this investment window for SMR-CCS is there, we think, viable until the 2030s. And then if there are strong policies for renewable hydrogen, those will shorten the investment window for fossil hydrogen so that it can close at the end of the 2020s. And make no mistake about this, there's nothing automatic about this. There's no inherent mechanism that will deliver this. So a key conclusion is this needs ambitious policy to drive down the cost of renewable hydrogen, because so far there's a cost gap. You cannot just leave it to the market to deliver all those kilowatt hours and terawatt hours of renewable hydrogen that you can see from our charts. There must be more than what we can currently see in the European Union's hydrogen strategy and the German hydrogen strategy and some others, where policy instruments are mentioned and considered, but in the end, we actually need those incentives and policy ends to cover the cost gap between fossil applications today and green hydrogen. Otherwise, this is not going to fly. And that's what we need to focus on next, on those policy instruments. So let me give you a last remark on delivery systems. And you already saw Angus' map that they produced for us of no regret corridors. We've identified 4 robust no regret corridors for early hydrogen pipelines. That's based on industrial demand. Again, you look at the map, remember what we saw before on industrial hydrogen, there are orders of magnitude differences. And again, you can see sometimes you can see 27 terawatt hours of industrial demand in pink. Sometimes it's only 3, and sometimes it's below 1 terawatt hour. So there's really differences built in here. But still, as Angus explained it, as you can look up in the report, taking into account several scenarios and times and snapshots in time and comparing that with our list of criteria to make this very robust, we yielded those 4 corridors. When we look at this, we think those corridors in itself and the work we have done here, focusing on hard to abate industrial demand in itself, is not a justification for creating a larger pan-European hydrogen backbone. However, there are things that we haven't incorporated here yet that was out of scope of this project, is really bringing in additional demand from the power sector, from aviation, maritime shipping. When we bring this in, this is will likely strengthen the case for a more expansive network of hydrogen pipelines. And then, as a little disclaimer, even when we look at other scenarios, and the Joint Research Center of the European Commission has done a great job on comparing future scenarios, and you can find that reference in our report. You can actually download the JRC file for this. What we see there for the future scenarios for 2050, the total hydrogen demand that we can see there is in the order of 1,000 to 2,000 terawatt hours for all applications of hydrogen. So when you compare that to today's natural gas demand, it becomes clear that the sheer energy needed is much lower than what's being sold and what's flowing through pipelines today in terms of natural gas. And so we conclude that even under the most optimistic scenarios, we'll have much smaller needs to deliver energy, and that will have implications, we think, for pipeline development. And therefore, we think that we should focus on those no-regret corridors in order to reduce the risk of oversizing hydrogen networks of the future. And therefore, we focus on this inescapable demand and robust green hydrogen corridors and storage. And that, bringing this all together, we think is actually good news, as Frank said at the beginning. This is great news because it reduces uncertainty. It shows us where are the early opportunities of anchoring hydrogen infrastructure around what we call inescapable demand from industry. And by this, we can overcome the chicken and egg problem of infrastructure and demand. And that's, we think, is actually our contribution with kind of the most positive message here. And those are, again, our key conclusions. There's high demand. There's an investment window for fossil-based hydrogen closing. And then there are no regret corridors. And with that, thanks for listening, and back to Frank. I can't hear Frank right now.
Okay, here we go. Thank you, Matthias. So what I was just saying is that we already asked the question what hydrogen could do for the industry, but it seems like that the question also goes in the other direction. What can the industry do for the ramp up of the hydrogen economy? And we have clear indications here that there's no regret demand from the industry, and this could serve as a really the anchor for ramping up the hydrogen economy, green hydrogen, with a potential window of blue as well in there. Joachim Barke, head of the unit that's responsible for the green transition of energy infrastructure in the European Commission. What is your thinking if you see these results, and what is also the Commission's view on this topic? The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Frank, and thanks very much to the Agora team for this invitation. I do hope that you can hear me properly. Otherwise, please let me know. I'm very glad to be able to comment today on your study, because mainly because it's always easier to comment on a study which you think underpins the policy that you're trying to pursue than on a study which shows the opposite. And to anticipate the conclusion, I think to a large extent, I mean, with of course some nuances, I think what you've done is first of all, very, very useful for the entire discussion out there. But I think it is also very helpful for us in, I think, indicating that, roughly speaking, we're in alignment and hopefully on the right track. I just want to start by saying, by way of disclaimer, I'm indeed head of unit in the infrastructure unit. So, I mean, I'm not responsible for our overall hydrogen strategy, but specifically sort of for the implications of that on infrastructure and on the 10E instrument in particular, which is, I think, also sort of the point of convergence of this particular study. Well, on the topic of hydrogen, as you said, when you invite people on hydrogen, you have a full audience, even online, because it is super topical. It is super topical, and we also think and believe that it is an inevitable part of the picture if we want to go to net zero. But it's important to underline that this is really linked to the net zero ambition, because this is where we need it. This is our ambition. And I think it's also important to underline what Matthias said in the beginning, that we are at a very early stage of hydrogen, of development of hydrogen, in particular green hydrogen. There are many uncertainties. It is also clear that when we talk about hydrogen and green hydrogen in particular, we are talking about what I think we have to call a luxury product. So one which will have to be used selectively where it is really needed. But even with these caveats, as I said, we do think it's an inevitable part of the picture, and hence it's important that we set the framework right from the beginning, so that in 2030 and towards 2050, basically we are on the right track. Now, the whole political discussion about hydrogen, if you look at it, I'd say there are probably two questions which are debated again and again on a very political level and which are very controversial. The first one is the one that I think you also touched upon, Matthias, and Angus as well. Which hydrogen? Is it going to be only green, or is it going to be green and blue? That's a very controversial debate, and I'm not going to go into that very much in detail because it makes my life easier. The second part of the debate is what infrastructure are we going to need? Is it going to be local? The famous clusters, or is there really this perspective to go to a sort of cross-border and ultimately pan-European grid? And I think it is to this second debate that this study really makes a very important contribution. Now, just a few words on demand and supply by way of introduction. Well, as I said, we do think in all net zero scenarios, hydrogen has to have a role. In our scenarios, we get to something in the order of 10% of final demand in 2050 for the net zero scenarios. One point perhaps which might explain to a certain extent some nuances in what you have presented today, and what we perhaps have in mind in a longer view, is that we do see from the beginning that, I mean, there are basically two lead sectors, and industry that is uncontested, but we do also see, and that is clearly sketched in the hydrogen strategy, that the transport sector is going to be a part of the development which will pull hydrogen in. I understand that is something that also you don't exclude, but you wanted to start from the most conservative assumptions. That's why you started with industry. Fair enough. But just to say, that's why perhaps we have there already a slightly larger view of the potential of uses, at least in a medium to long-term perspective. I think it is clear that the hydrogen market, also that we forecast, will not have the same volume in terms of consumption as today's natural gas market. I think there we also agree. That being said, it is true that apart from hydrogen, we do also see a role for other gases, renewable gases in particular, going forward, and natural gas is, as you know, still playing a certain role in our scenarios for a transition period, although then declining much more steeply, in particular after 2030. Now, on the question of blue and green, what you call the blue-green or the fast green scenario, indeed, as you rightly said, I mean, we also see that in the long term, the form of hydrogen which is most compatible with the strategy is indeed clearly green renewable hydrogen. But as we've said in the strategy, we do see a certain role also for other forms of low carbon hydrogen, especially as we want to ramp up the market. And if we now start to talk about infrastructure, there is, of course, one question about how are we going to fill that infrastructure in an economic way so that it's used economically. But I will not go further into this particular question now, but come to really to the infrastructure dimension, which is where I think, at least personally, I'm most interested in the outcomes of your study. So, I mean, as I said, there is this discussion at times even led sort of on an ideological level. Are we going to have local clusters only, or an integrated system? Now, what we have put out a bit as our vision in the hydrogen strategy is that this is basically two steps. There will be probably a rather sort of clusterized development in the first step, but we do see this this longer, medium to longer term development where indeed these clusters will be increasingly connected through infrastructure. And this, I think, is largely in line, I would say, with what I take to be the results of your study here, which say clearly that, I mean, even if you depart from the most conservative assumptions and you take only the demand, which cannot be served otherwise, and even if you go for the most conservative scenarios, already in this situation, you come to the conclusion that, yes, it does make economic sense to have cross-border transport of hydrogen by pipeline. And I think for us, I mean, that is really the key conclusion from your study, which I think is, I would say, confirms us in the policy approach that, that we have taken. Now, as I said, then it depends, according to your study, very much which demand sectors do you take into account from the beginning. We would probably take a slightly larger view from the start, but all of this, of course, has to be modeled, which isn't perhaps that obvious. What is, of course, important is that the conclusions that you come to in terms of your infrastructure do depend, and that's why we cannot avoid this discussion ultimately, on the source of hydrogen that you take into account, and that informs some of your scenarios. And I understand that is one of the key limitations that maybe then it would be indeed interesting to work on in the future, is that here you look at sort of electrolyzers which are specifically fed by sort of dedicated renewable generation. And the question, I think, of how would the picture look if we take into account grid electricity, I think is indeed a very interesting one, to which I'd like to come back in a second. But again, for us, the key conclusion here is that, I mean, we have proposed to make hydrogen a part of our pan-European cross-border infrastructure policy by proposing that in the 10-year framework, we want to have hydrogen infrastructure. And I think on that, your study basically underpins our proposal, and that's why we are, I think, very heartened by this outcome. Now, two aspects I want to still go into a little bit. Now, the first one, what then is the type of infrastructure that will be needed? Clearly, I mean, as you say, and we would agree, pipeline infrastructure is an economic transport option, and probably the most economic transport option, so it is quite relevant. And that then indeed brings us very quickly to the question of new build versus repurposing. Now, again, our conclusion is similar, and I think you also quoted the JRC on this and other statistics. Repurposing is clearly an economic option which can save costs, repurposing of existing gas infrastructure. That's also something which has been confirmed in the Council conclusion on hydrogen that were adopted at the end of last year. So I think that clearly establishes the link, as Angus has said, to the existing gas infrastructure as an economic possibility. Just on a side note, it is of course very important to differentiate that question from the question of, do we want to go for pure hydrogen infrastructure or do we support blending? I think you call it commingling in your study, and you haven't gone into that too much, but in today's presentation. But again, here I think we depart from a similar assumption that ultimately, I mean, even for economic reasons, in order to bring out the full value of hydrogen, which, as I said, is a luxury product, we see blending. I would say we see certain limitations in the approach, and it can play a role, but sort of in the medium to long term, again, I think we would stress that this approach has limitations, and pure hydrogen is probably what the market will need. Now, likewise, there are other infrastructure elements such as storage. I think it's very important that you stress that, and we also proposed in our 10-year proposal to include underground storage as part of the infrastructure, which should be covered. And I think you've confirmed that this seems to be indeed a very important part of the economic equation, as it might be a very economic way to basically to store hydrogen and to make it tradable in that sense. Now, why do we want to have this as part of our 10E framework? And I think that brings us to the necessity that we see to come to some kind of planning framework for hydrogen infrastructure. And again, we think that I would think that this presentation is important in showing that there is an economic case for cross-border infrastructure. I think that means, in our view, that it's also necessary to have a framework which allows the planning of such cross-border infrastructure in a cross-border and ultimately trans-European framework. And again, since repurposing is probably going to be an important part of it, we do think that the most logical way of starting this is by integrating it in the current gas TYNDP. And this is therefore what we have proposed. On a side note, but I mean, this is actually an important point, is when I talk about planning, what I mean is that we need to have a framework for projects that are promoted by real promoters. So, I mean, all the modeling that we do and all the planning framework, that we from our side propose only makes sense if ultimately they are real project promoters which want to invest and which will bring forward their projects. And what we've seen already is that for the current gas TYNDP, for example, there are quite a number of hydrogen infrastructure projects also which have been brought forward. We cannot currently, with our policy framework, promote them in the context of 10E because it's not covered in the current scope. But it just means that there is an interest, and we would like to foster that interest by bringing it in the scope. Now, a last remark on coming back to the question of the interlinkage with the electricity grid. I think that's ultimately where we want to go. We do think it is important that studies such as yours cover in the next step also the interlinkage between the future hydrogen grid and the electricity grid, and as an element sort of linking them, the electrolyzers. We think it is also important that this kind of exercise is done by the TSOs and by the project promoters themselves, who will have to actually own and operate these kind of infrastructure assets. That's why we want to, first of all, as I said, have set up a sort of TYNDP style planning for hydrogen. And in a second step, we think it is important that this is then linked with the electricity planning in a much closer way than as we have today. And as I said, that it is ultimately also done by the industrial actors who are responsible for owning and operating these assets. So, by way of conclusion, let me say, I think sort of our idea about how the hydrogen market will evolve, but again, it will depend on the economic actors, whether that's going to happen, is that in principle, let's say the development towards something like an EU-wide market, liquid market, where hydrogen is traded, in principle as a commodity, could be a beneficial development. And I think what we see here in your study, and which is helpful, is some indication that this is indeed could become economically rational. There are still many things that need to be further assessed, the different demand sectors that are not yet part of this study, the interactions between electricity and gas. But we do think that there is, let's say, a good amount of evidence in this study pointing to the direction that this kind of more integrated infrastructure, which is then ultimately to serve also more integrated trading of hydrogen on a cross-border and ultimately European level, is likely to be the economically rational model. And I think that's for us a very important takeaway. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Joachim Barke, for this very broad presentation also of the EU Commission's position. Craig, before we hand over to you, I have one single question to ask towards Angus. We also saw it in the chat already coming up. Given the fact that transforming gas grids is a huge anchor of maybe future hydrogen infrastructure, could you give us a very brief elaboration what the big challenge is doing so and what the cost expectations are doing this?
Well, so I think there's quite a lot of technical challenges involved in converting the existing gas pipelines to be able to transport effectively 100% hydrogen. But the fact that it is possible is really interesting. Now, for our study, we relied on the study that was done by Guidehouse on behalf of 11 EU TSOs, and that was quite clear in its identification that the cost of a repurposed gas pipeline is lower than the cost of a new build hydrogen pipeline. So that's kind of indicating that that there's a lot of value in doing it. But I think the key point about that study was that it was an indication from the gas TSOs that they could release some of their gas pipelines to be repurposed for hydrogen pipelines. So it tells us that actually this is possible, not just from an establishing a hydrogen infrastructure perspective, but also in sort of the decommissioning of the gas infrastructure perspective.
Thank you for that. So, Craig, you have followed quite closely what was going on in the Q&A. And well, what are the most interesting things to put here on the table from your perspective that came up in the Q&A section?
Yes, thanks, Frank. But first of all, I would really like to say thank you to Gnevomir, who has been assiduously answering questions in the Q&A. So if you take a look, everyone, at the answered section of the Q&A, you'll probably find all kinds of questions there. He's answered 54 questions during this time. So if I switch over now, we have another 20 minutes of Q&A. I'd like to cluster the questions a bit because there is some overlap and we just have so many. I'll start with Ines Rutschmann. Did you have a look at the cost for households if they heated their homes with hydrogen? European industry, hydrogen industry wants to supply that demand. I could also throw in Michael Savigny's question about what about demand for CHP plants. So we got a number of those questions about, is this no regret demand? Maybe Angus, would you like to field that?
Sure, thanks, Craig. Say that the scope of this project was to look at what Agora thought was the no regret demand, and this is, I think it's kind of right to characterize it as no regret demand. This is demand that has no alternative, no viable alternative other than using hydrogen. Now, households could be electrified. You could electrify the heat load in households, and therefore we might regret converting them to hydrogen. But whether we actually do regret that, I think, when we get there, when we look backwards, do we regret it? I think those questions really have to also look at the flip side. We might regret electrification. We might discover that hydrogen was the cheaper way of doing this. But a lot of the decisions need to be made in advance. And in order to do that, you really need to look very closely at the underlying economics and the costs. And as I said in my final slide, getting decarbonisation right is harder than just doing it. Okay, so I think that's there. With regards to CHPs, I think that's a really interesting question. I think there's an awful lot of potential for hydrogen to become a really useful storage medium for renewable electricity. So we are going to be creating it from renewable electricity, and we are going to be needing to convert that hydrogen back to power through hydrogen-powered power plants.
All right, thank you. Joachim Balke, we have a question from Nathan Whitkop. He'd like to know about concerns that handling hydrogen operations at TSOs might run counter to EU antitrust rules about unbundling. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, this is let's say a question about how we want to organize the internal market for hydrogen. And I have to be quite frank. I mean, this is the type of question that we have not yet answered as a commission, that we're investigating at the moment. The colleagues in the internal market department, and on which we plan to come forward with some proposals later this year. I mean, it is not an easy question. As I said, we do have a certain idea that sort of commodity style trading for hydrogen might ultimately be a beneficial model. But at the same time, sort of how much regulation do you need just now for the hydrogen market, which is at a relatively sort of early stage. I think that is a question we are currently analyzing, and where we will come out with a reply later this year. What we have tried to put forward when it comes to infrastructure policy is that we would like there to be a kind of, as I said, hydrogen infrastructure planning. And we think that for the moment that can realistically probably best be done by the existing gas TSO network. Now, that does not preempt the question who should own and operate those pipelines. As I said, that question is something we're still looking into.
All right, thank you. Matthias, maybe a question for you. Transport and hydrogen. I mean, we've already said this is a call about no regret, but I have a question here about, couldn't hydrogen and transport be a way of ramping up and getting the costs down? Is it a way of moving towards mass production?
I think the tricky thing about transport is that it more hides than it illuminates what we're talking about. It's such a broad sector. And the big technological discussion is really, in many cases, about ground-based transport, passenger cars, trucks. And there we are seeing so much competition with battery electric vehicles. Now, as soon as you move to other subsectors of transport, aviation, maritime shipping gets way more complicated, and there will be other molecules involved than just having a fuel cell that might do the job in a passenger car. So when we talk about the question of what role might ammonia play in maritime shipping, and what exactly will we do as a substitute for kerosene, something like power to liquid or so, those are things that we think are very likely hard to abate. They are, but they were actually out of scope of this project, which was reduced to the very clear hard to abate in industrial applications. But we agree that on top of that, we will also need to further analyze hard to abate in transport, which is aviation, maritime shipping. All right. Speaking of ammonia and different types of gases, we have a question from Hendrik Paul. Could the existing global LNG infrastructure also be used for H2? And actually, I'd like to break this up into two questions. There's the one question about, can we have a global hydrogen economy? And the other question of, is it easy to just transfer from one type of gas, from natural gas to hydrogen? Angus, maybe you can answer the second part of that question. Is it easy to transfer gases within an infrastructure?
With regards to LNG infrastructure, whether we can convert it to liquid hydrogen, I suspect the answer is it's nowhere near as easy as it is to do it for gaseous pipelines and converting them from methane to hydrogen. Liquid hydrogen needs to be stored at a much lower temperature. It's a simple thing like that, and the LNG infrastructure will be designed to handle the temperature of liquid methane, which is a higher temperature than that of liquid hydrogen. Okay. So I think technically it would be. I'm not saying no, and I'm not an engineer. I'm not an expert in this particular thing, but that would be my initial observation.
Okay. Well, we're already seeing in the Netherlands, we're seeing a switch based on calorific gas. We're seeing that in Germany as well, between different qualities of natural gas. So I would assume there's going to be something that needs to be retrofitted there. But let's switch to the global hydrogen economy question. Is there going to be a global hydrogen economy? Who would like to field that?
Maybe I can start and then hand over to Angus if he wants to add on that. The one thing is that the term hydrogen economy, sometimes people really refer to hydrogen and others mean anything that is being derived from hydrogen. And when we adopt the broader definition, then it makes, because then it connects to what I said before, then we're talking about a whole range of chemicals and molecules. And then the question is, what is it that you derive and how can you transport it? Hydrogen itself is difficult to transport. There are ways of doing that. But as soon as you have other molecules and can actually use those molecules at the end as the destination without reconverting them, then things become easier. That's the question of, broader speaking, either electrofuels, some called power fuels, but that range of molecules includes ammonia and power to liquids, so a substitute for kerosene. And this can be done by using existing infrastructure, because we are able to transport liquids around the globe. And we also have ammonia transport. As soon as we can tap existing infrastructure, the hydrogen economy, that part of the hydrogen economy, has more chances of being realized at lower cost when you can use existing assets. But never forget, as soon as you want to use more complex molecules with carbon, like power to liquids, a substitute for kerosene, so those synthetic carbon molecules need a source of carbon. And then the question becomes, what is our sustainable source of carbon in the long run? You can always tap your next coal power plant, capture the carbon, and there you go with your new e-fuel. But the question is, what is the transition path to supplying sustainable e-fuels around the globe? That's more of an open question then.
Angus, did you want to? Yeah,
Angus, do you want to follow up?
Yeah, sure. I think I agree with everything Matthias has said there. I think once you've got hydrogen into liquid form, you know, if you want to reconvert that back to gaseous hydrogen and then use gaseous hydrogen, there's going to be a cost associated in doing that. Now, that cost might be quite low if you're talking about liquid hydrogen stored at cryogenic temperatures, but for every other form of liquid hydrogen, to the organic carriers and the e-fuels and so on and so forth, the conversion back to gaseous hydrogen is going to be very, very expensive.
Well, and Craig, I would also like Joachim Bartke to ask whether the European Commission is looking for, within its hydrogen strategy, solely of an in-border or domestic hydrogen production in European countries, or whether there are also ideas of looking more broad, where it could be potential regions where hydrogen could be produced quite cheaply, and how is this interlinked with the European hydrogen strategy and the infrastructure talks you're having?
Yeah, indeed. I mean, this is the, if I said in the beginning that there are sort of two difficult political questions, I think this is the third one. I mean, is it going to be domestic or imported, including from third countries? I think that is also an important, let's say, dimension that we're looking at, that we've looked at in the context of the hydrogen strategy. Or, for example, this week we've published a document on our neighborhood policy, which has a lot of things to say about the southern neighborhood policy in particular, has a lot of things to say about sort of Green Deal partnerships, I would say. And in this context, one element, for example, that we're looking at, what is the potential to produce green hydrogen, for example, in a country such as Morocco. So, okay, you can see it from that. I mean, this is, here we're talking about neighborhood policy, perhaps, rather than a global market. I think clearly, I mean, all the economic caveats that Angus and Matthias have mentioned apply, and we have to see how do the cost of transport play in then in relation to cost advantages in the production of green hydrogen. I think this has to be assessed from an economic perspective. And the other element which is important, I mean, specifically now, if we look at neighborhood policy, is that we have to, of course, take into account our own needs in terms of green hydrogen consumption. But it is always important to keep in mind now, let's say from a neighborhood policy perspective, also what are the needs of the countries which have the potential to produce it, because many of them face a strongly growing domestic energy demand as well. And of course, we want them to also fulfill that demand as much as possible with clean electricity and energy. So there is it is a relevant vector, I would say, in the policy, but has to be looked at also with a number of caveats, I would say.
Okay, Craig, We have 8 minutes left. What kind of questions do we still have left open that we should answer in the panel here, on the panel here?
Well, there's one question, and then maybe if we have time, but we also have a few minutes of wrap up as well, and we do want to end at the top of the hour. So I have a question from Han Grein. I hope I'm pronouncing the name right. The petrochemical sector is listed as no regret demand, but the slide number 4, maybe some of you remember it, shows that demand from refineries is almost gone by 2040. How does this affect the no regret status of the petrochemical demand? Angus, maybe this is for you.
Yeah, I'll take it, but I think Matthias will want to come on it as well. So one of the underlying assumptions that we've made in the project is that refineries in Europe effectively close before we get to 2050, and that Europe is then importing its liquids from elsewhere. It's the e-fuels thing that we were just talking about. Matthias, would you like to expand on that?
Yeah, that's pretty much the idea. I mean, refineries face a strong transformation in the demand that they are currently matching with their supply. So there is a big transformation ongoing if we want to reach climate neutrality. And as Angus said, those refinery products are among those that we can transport best, even globally. And we can see that there will be places on this planet where we can produce them much easier, both for the renewable input and even the carbon capture when we do direct air capture with this to produce carbon-containing molecules.
All right, so just in the interest of finishing on time, I think I will close up the Q&A session here. There is one word I would add, because no one has said it, but it was a word everyone used, all my colleagues at Agora used when we were talking about this, and it's the word champagne. Hydrogen is the champagne of the energy transition. You're not going to use it everywhere. You don't pour it on your cornflakes for breakfast. So just as an abstract idea, and I'll hand over to Frank now for concluding remarks.
Yeah, thanks, Frank, very much. Thank you very much also for the panelists for this interesting discussion and for the observations you brought and shed light on it. For me, the biggest surprise was really in the early beginning that 60% of our huge attendants were in favor of prioritizing industry when ramping up the hydrogen economy. So our presumption that we did on the study to elaborate a no regret infrastructure demand around an industrial demand has built some confidence in me that this is a quite good way forward. And also, like Joachim Balke said, this clusters, industrial clusters, could serve as the anchor for ramping up an hydrogen economy in Europe. And then, of course, competition will show us what other sectors, other uses might join in this conversation, where we all end up using hydrogen in. And well, it's in the making, but make no mistake, we need huge policy intervention at the beginning to start this. And we are nowhere close having this. We are just discussing on support schemes for hydrogen ramp up in various contexts, but nobody has yet established one. And this is what needs to be done next for the ultimate kickoff of the whole hydrogen economy. And we have the critical willingness now open at the European level. We have the German election ahead of us, where we definitely afterwards need to have the first steps into serious support for ramping up an hydrogen economy. That's it for now. Nicola, would you please give us the closing remarks from your perspective of this whole event? Thanks a lot.
Yes, thank you very much, everyone on the panel, and also to the audience. We had a maximum of 630 persons watching from all over the world, as we saw when we had the Mentimeter chart at the beginning, which showed that there were people from South America, Africa, Asia, Europe, and what have you. We will publish the recording very soon. It should be online Monday at the latest. The report and the presentation, we shared the link several times in the chat. We will share it once more. I believe Craig is already putting it into the chat again. Those can be found on the website. If you're interested in staying up to date on all our latest studies or upcoming events, I advise you to register for our newsletter. And Craig, I believe you will also put the link in there. If you're interested in the work AFRY does, then visit their website and see if there's something interesting for you. And other than that, there are no events planned, no public events planned for the next 2 weeks, but we will surely be back in March with more webinars, and we will inform all subscribers of our newsletter about any upcoming events. And you can, of course, always look in the events section of our website. Whatever the time is at your place now, have a good start of the day, rest of the day, lunchtime, or what have you, and stay healthy. And we hope to see you soon. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.